December 7, 1942. 2,100 hours. The mouth of the Gironde Estuary, off the coast of occupied France. A British submarine, HMS Tuna, surfaces roughly 10 miles offshore under cover of darkness, and 6 small folding canoes are lowered one by one over her casing into the cold Atlantic swell. Each is barely 16 feet long, built from a plywood bottom board and a canvas skin stretched over a collapsible timber frame, a design closer to a sporting kayak than anything the Admiralty had ever before sent into direct combat against an enemy target. 10 Royal Marines, working in 2-man crews, climb down into 6 boats that together weigh less, fully loaded with limpet mines, weapons, and rations, than a single depth charge. Their target lies 70 miles upriver, deep inside the most heavily patrolled port complex on the entire French Atlantic coast, the docks of Bordeaux, where German blockade-running merchant ships load rubber, tin, tungsten, and other strategic raw materials smuggled in from Japanese-held territory in the Far East. Cargo the Third Reich's war economy cannot function without, and cannot obtain any other way. No bomber can reach these ships without killing French civilians by the hundred in a crowded dockside city. No warship can approach without triggering coastal defenses. That would end any raid in minutes. The only way in is by water, at night, past patrol boats, searchlights, sentries, and a boom defense strung across the river specifically to stop exactly this kind of infiltration, using a vessel small enough, quiet enough, and low enough in the water that nobody watching the river has ever seriously considered it a threat worth guarding against. Of the 10 men who paddle away from Tuna that night, 2 will return to Britain. 6 German ships, deep inside the best defended harbor in occupied France, will never sail again undamaged. This is how a handful of collapsible canoes did what neither the RAF nor the Royal Navy could do to Bordeaux, and did it without firing a single shot. The strategic problem Bordeaux represented had been sharpening for the better part of 2 years. By the autumn of 1942, and it centered on a category of German shipping that conventional Allied forces found almost impossible to interdict through any of the ordinary means available to them. Since the fall of France in 1940, the port of Bordeaux, well inland along the Gironde Estuary, and consequently shielded from direct naval bombardment by miles of shallow, difficult, heavily fortified river approach, had become one of the principal terminals for German blockade-running merchant ships. Vessels that slipped through the Allied naval blockade of Europe carrying strategic raw materials, rubber, tin, tungsten, and specialized manufacturing equipment, sourced from Japanese-controlled territory in the Far East and smuggled across 2 oceans specifically to feed a German war industry that had no domestic source for several of these critical materials. British intelligence, working from intercepted Japanese diplomatic and commercial signals trafficked between Tokyo and the Japanese embassy in Berlin, had built up a detailed and increasingly alarming picture of exactly how much material was passing through Bordeaux's docks, and exactly how directly that material fed German aircraft production, submarine construction, and the broader war economy that conventional bombing of German industrial cities was already struggling to meaningfully degrade. The problem was not identifying the target. British planners knew precisely which ships were tied up at which berths in Bordeaux harbor at any given time. Information gathered through a combination of signals intelligence and reports from French resistance networks operating in and around the port. The problem was reaching them. Every conventional method of attacking shipping inside Bordeaux harbor carried a cost that made the operation, by the standards applied to almost any other Allied bombing or raiding target of the period, effectively impossible to authorize. RAF Bomber Command could, in principle, have mounted a raid against the docks, but Bordeaux was a functioning French city with a substantial civilian population living and working in close proximity to the harbor, and the kind of area bombing that would have been required to reliably destroy shipping moored among crowded dockside warehouses and residential streets would have inflicted French civilian casualties on a scale the British government, already sensitive to the political costs of Allied bombing in occupied territory, judged entirely unacceptable, particularly against a target whose military value, however real, did not obviously justify that scale of collateral loss among an occupied and nominally friendly population. A conventional naval strike, surface ships or submarines closing to attack the harbor directly, was equally out of the question. The Gironde Estuary's approach was shallow, difficult to navigate, and defended by coastal artillery batteries, and any warship large enough to carry a meaningful offensive weapons load would have had to run a gauntlet of fixed defenses specifically cited to prevent exactly this kind of direct naval assault, a risk that, for the value of a handful of merchant ships, no naval planner judged worth the potential loss of a warship Britain could not easily replace. What remained, after every conventional option had been examined and set aside, was the possibility of a small, covert raiding party, inserted quietly, moving without detection through the same stretch of water the Germans controlled, but could not possibly patrol in its entirety, close enough to attach explosive charges directly to the hulls of the target, ships by hand. The man who had already spent 2 years developing exactly the kind of unit and the kind of equipment such a raid would require, was Major Herbert Blondie Hassler, a Royal Marines officer whose interest in small boats and canoes long predated any military application, tracing back to a childhood spent building his own canoe from instructions in a boy's hobby magazine. Hassler had served in Norway during the ill-fated 1940 campaign, and had returned convinced that small, quiet, low-profile craft, canoes and folding kayaks in particular, represented a genuinely underexploited category of military capability, vessels that conventional naval and military planners tended to dismiss as recreational equipment entirely unsuited to serious combat use, but that, Hassler believed, could achieve exactly the kind of silent, undetected approach to a heavily defended target that no conventional landing craft, submarine or surface vessel could match. He proposed the concept to the Admiralty directly, and over the following 2 years, was given the resources to form and train a specialized unit, the Royal Marines Boom Patrol Detachment, built specifically around the tactical concept of using collapsible canoes to penetrate enemy harbor defenses and attack shipping with hand-placed limpet mines. A unit whose very existence reflected the same institutional willingness to gamble on an unconventional, apparently underarmed solution that had already produced the Q-ship, the armed trawler, and the midget submarine earlier in the same broader war. The equipment Hassler's unit trained with was, by any conventional military standard, close to the least impressive weapons platform the Royal Navy fielded anywhere in its wartime order of battle. The Cockle Mark II, the specific canoe design selected for the Bordeaux raid, was a 2-man folding kayak roughly 16 feet long, built around a collapsible timber frame over which a canvas skin was stretched and laced, with the plywood floor section providing the only real rigidity the hull possessed. It had no engine, propelled entirely by wooden double-bladed paddles worked by the 2-man crew, no armor of any kind, and a hull that a determined swimmer could puncture with a knife in seconds, had it ever been caught and boarded. Loaded for the Bordeaux operation, each canoe carried its 2-man crew, limpet mines, weapons, rations, and equipment for the extended overland escape that would follow the attack, a load that left the low, canvas-sided hull with barely a few inches of freeboard above the waterline even in calm water, and considerably less once the canoes reached the open tidal race at the mouth of the Gironde, where the meeting of river current and Atlantic tide produces a stretch of genuinely dangerous, unpredictable water, even for a properly seaworthy vessel, let alone a canvas and plywood kayak loaded to within a few inches of swamping. Hassler and his men trained intensively through the second half of 1942, developing and rehearsing a specific technique they called freezing, remaining absolutely motionless in the canoe, paddles resting, silhouette lowered as close to the waterline as possible. The moment any German sentry, patrol boat, or searchlight swept toward them, on the calculated assumption that a low, dark, unmoving shape close to the water's surface at night was, to a tired sentry scanning a wide stretch of river, indistinguishable from driftwood, a shadow, or simply nothing worth a second look at, all a piece of applied psychology closely related to the same principle that had made the Q ship's disguise effective a generation earlier, that a defender's attention, and a defender's willingness to investigate an ambiguous contact thoroughly, is a finite and exploitable resource. Before we get into the raid itself, if you're finding this deep dive into ww2 history trench interesting, subscribing takes a second and supports the channel. The submarine HMS Tuna, under Lieutenant Commander Dick Rakes, carried the raiding party and their 6 canoes across the Bay of Biscay and surfaced roughly 10 miles off the mouth of the Gironde Estuary on the evening of December 7, 1942. The launch itself immediately reduced the raiding force before a single mile of the mission had actually been paddled. One canoe, Cachalot, crewed by Marines Ellery and Fisher, was damaged during the process of being lowered from the submarine's casing into the water and proved unusable, forcing her crew to remain aboard Tuna while the remaining 5 canoes, Catfish, Crayfish, Conger, Cuttlefish, and Coalfish, set off alone into open water toward a stretch of tidal race at the estuary mouth that Hassler's own planning had identified in advance as one of the most dangerous single obstacles the entire mission would face. A point where the ebbing river current met incoming Atlantic swell to produce standing waves of 5 feet or more, conditions that a canoe loaded to within inches of her freeboard, crewed by 2 men working wooden paddles, had almost no margin to survive if anything went even slightly wrong. It went wrong almost immediately. Conger, crewed by Corporal George Sheard and Marine David Moffat, capsized in the tide race, and although the other canoes attempted to keep her 2 crewmen with them by towing them through the water, the decision was eventually made, under Hassler's direct order and in conditions that offered no better alternative, to have Sheard and Moffat attempt to swim the remaining distance to shore rather than continue slowing the entire raiding party's progress at a moment when every remaining hour of darkness mattered to the mission's chances of reaching Bordeaux before German patrols increased in response to any sign of activity on the river. Neither man reached the shore alive. Their bodies, recovered separately over the following days, showed they had ultimately succumbed to hypothermia in the near-freezing December water rather than drowning outright, becoming, within the first hours of the operation, the raid's first fatalities, before either the Germans defending the river or the objective in Bordeaux itself had claimed a single one of the mission's 10 men. The tide race and the general chaos of the first night's crossing scattered the surviving canoes further than Hassler's planning had anticipated, and 2 more of the original 5 were lost to the mission over the following day, without ever reaching their objective. Cuttlefish, crewed by Lieutenant John McKinnon and Marine James Conway, became separated from the rest of the flotilla and, after her hull was damaged in a further mishap, her crew was forced to abandon the canoe entirely and continue on foot, eventually being captured by German forces after several days attempting to make their way toward the Spanish frontier on land alone. A considerably longer and more exposed overland journey than the mission had originally planned for any of its participants. Coalfish, crewed by Sergeant Samuel Wallace and Marine Robert Ewart, was discovered and captured by German patrols on the river itself, their canoe and equipment found before they had any opportunity to reach Bordeaux or to attempt an escape overland at all. Both captured crews, McKinnon and Conway from Cuttlefish, Wallace and Ewart from Coalfish were held, interrogated, and ultimately executed by German forces under the terms of Adolf Hitler's Commando Order of October 1942, a standing directive requiring that any Allied commando personnel captured during raiding operations, regardless of whether they were in uniform, regardless of whether they attempted to surrender, be summarily killed rather than treated as prisoners of war under the ordinary conventions of international law. A policy the four men had no realistic way of knowing existed with certainty at the time of their capture, and one that transformed what might, under conventional rules of war, have been a period of captivity, followed eventually by repatriation into a certain death sentence the moment German forces confirmed their identity as raiding commandos rather than conventional combat troops that left to Canoes, Catfish, crewed by Hassler himself and Marine Bill Sparks, and Crayfish, crewed by Corporal Albert Laver and Marine William Mills, to continue the mission alone, roughly having the raiding force within the first 24 hours of an operation that had originally sailed from HMS Tuna with 10 men across 5 canoes. German awareness that something was underway on the river had, by this point, clearly increased, evidenced by a marked rise in the frequency and intensity of patrol activity along the Gironde over the following days. A response. Hassler's 2 remaining crews had to navigate around entirely through the discipline of their training, rather than through any additional resources or support the mission could call upon once it was underway. Over the following 4 nights, Catfish and Crayfish worked their way further upriver toward Bordeaux, using a pattern that became the defining rhythm of the entire operation, paddling only during the hours of full darkness, taking advantage of the tidal flow wherever possible to conserve the crew's rapidly depleting physical strength, and hauling the canoes ashore each morning before first light to conceal themselves and their boats in riverbank undergrowth for the full length of each day, lying motionless and largely silent through daylight hours while German search parties, alerted by the discovery of the captured and lost canoes, worked the riverbanks and the water in a steadily intensifying effort to locate whatever remained of the raiding party before it could reach its objective. The physical toll of this routine, 4 consecutive nights of sustained paddling against a strong ebb tide that repeatedly slowed the 2 canoes' progress, far below what Hassler's original planning had assumed, combined with days spent cold, wet, and largely immobile in concealment rather than resting properly, left both crews in a state of considerable physical exhaustion by the time they finally approached the Bordeaux dock complex itself, on the night of December 11th into the 12th, a delay from the operation's original schedule that Hassler judged necessary rather than optional, given the increasingly obvious German search effort that any attempt to rush the final approach would very likely have run directly into. The attack on the night of December 11th unfolded with a level of close-range tension that neither crew's training, however extensive, could have fully prepared them for in practice. Working their way into the crowded dock basin among the more German merchant ships, both canoes had to pass, at points, within feet of German sentries posted along the quayside and aboard the ships themselves, relying entirely on the freezing technique Hassler's unit had drilled so extensively in the months before the operation, remaining absolutely motionless in the water, paddles still, silhouettes lowered as close to the surface as the loaded canoes allowed. On more than one occasion, passing directly beneath the sentry's torch beam, or within earshot of German crewmen singing or talking aboard the very ships they had come to sink, without triggering any alarm, the low, dark, largely stationary shape of a canoe close to the water, apparently indistinguishable in the dim dockside lighting, and to sentries who had no specific reason to expect an attack by canoe rather than by any more conventional means, from ordinary harbor debris or shadow. Working methodically over a period of roughly 2 to 3 hours, both crews moved from ship to ship, using magnetic holders to secure the canoe alongside each target's hull long enough to lower limpet mines on extendable rods and clamp them to the ship's plating below the waterline, spacing multiple mines along a single hull wherever possible to maximize the structural damage a coordinated detonation would inflict. Before moving on, silently, to the next target, each mine's time delay fuse activated at the moment of placement and set to detonate roughly 9 hours later, timed deliberately to give both crews the full remaining hours of darkness, and the following day to withdraw from the immediate area of the port before the explosions began, and German search efforts intensified in direct response. By the time both canoes had exhausted their supply of limpet mines and begun their withdrawal downriver in the final hours before dawn on December 12, they had between them placed charges against a total of 6 German ships moored within the Bordeaux dock complex. Mines fixed to hulls across the harbor in a pattern deliberately spread wide enough that no single German damage control effort, however well organized, once the first explosions began, could realistically hope to address more than a fraction of the affected vessels before the remaining charges detonated in turn. Both crews, their mission complete and their limpet mine supply exhausted, worked their way back downriver over the following hours, eventually coming ashore, sinking their 2 remaining canoes to destroy the evidence of exactly how the attack had been delivered, and splitting into their original 2-man teams to begin the second, and in several ways more physically demanding, phase of the entire operation, an overland escape of roughly 100 miles across occupied France, on foot, without papers, without local language fluency beyond what limited French either men happened to speak, relying entirely on contact with French resistance networks that combined operations planning had identified in advance as the raiding party's only realistic route to eventual safety in neutral Spain. Corporal Albert Laver and Marine William Mills of Crayfish were captured by German forces roughly 2 days into this overland phase, before they had traveled far enough to make effective contact with resistance networks capable of moving them clear of the immediate search area, and were subsequently executed under the same commando order that had already claimed the 4 men captured earlier in the operation, bringing the total number of cockleshell raiders killed, either during the river approach or after capture, to 8. Of the original 10 who had set out from HMS Tuna, only Hassler and Sparks, the crew of Catfish, ultimately evaded capture entirely, moving separately from Laver and Mills once ashore. The 2 men made contact with French resistance networks operating in the region around Ruffick and were passed, over a period of weeks, and through a chain of resistance contacts that itself represented a considerable and continuing risk to every French civilian involved in sheltering and moving. 2 escaped British commandos across occupied territory, southward toward the Pyrenees, eventually crossing the mountains into neutral Spain in February 1943, roughly 2 months after the raid itself had begun, and finally making their way back to Britain by April 1943, close to 5 months after they had first climbed down from HMS Tuna's casing into a canoe loaded with limpet mines and rations for a mission that both men, and every other man who had set out on it, had been told from the outset carried a genuinely low probability of full survival, regardless of whether the attack itself succeeded. The physical damage the raid inflicted on Bordeaux's dock complex, considerable as it was, ultimately fell short of the complete harbor blockage that combined operations planners had originally hoped a fully successful 6-canoe operation might achieve. 6 German ships were damaged by the limpet mines. Hassler's 2 surviving crews had managed to place, some of them severely enough to require extended repair before they could return to service. But the port itself was neither closed nor rendered permanently unusable, and German blockade-running traffic through Bordeaux, while disrupted for a period, ultimately resumed once repairs to the damaged vessels and to the port's operational capacity were complete. Judged purely against the operation's own most ambitious original objective, a complete, sustained interdiction of Bordeaux's function as a blockade-running terminal. Operation Frankton fell short, a fact the operation's own official assessments and Hassler's later published accounts acknowledged candidly rather than attempting to inflate the raid's tactical results beyond what the 6 damaged ships actually represented. But the raid's significance, much as with several of the other apparently underarmed or under-resourced British operations of the same broader war, was never measured solely by the tonnage of shipping actually sunk or the precise duration of the disruption to German harbor operations. And the assessments offered by the men who had commissioned and overseen the operation reflected exactly this broader calculation. Winston Churchill, in his own later assessment of the raid's value, expressed the view that the operation had shortened the war by a period of roughly 6 months, a claim that resists precise verification through any single measurable metric, but that reflected Churchill's own judgment of the raid's cumulative strategic effect. The psychological demonstration to German occupation forces across the entirety of the French Atlantic coast that no harbor, however far inland, however heavily patrolled, however seemingly secure from direct Allied attack by any conventional means, could be considered genuinely safe from a raiding party willing and able to approach entirely undetected by water, a demonstration that, once made, could not be unmade, and that forced German commanders across every similarly positioned inland port facility to divert scarce defensive resources, additional patrols, additional searchlights, additional garrison troops, toward guarding against a threat that, before December 1942, had never seriously featured in their defensive planning at all. Admiral Lord Louis Mountbatten, who as Chief of Combined Operations, had overseen the raid's planning and had, by several accounts, initially been reluctant to risk Hassler himself on an operation judged, from the outset, to carry a genuinely low probability of the raid's commander surviving it, described Operation Frankton afterward, in words later carved into stone at the Royal Marines' current headquarters, as the most courageous and imaginative of all the raids ever carried out by the men of Combined Operations Command, assessment offered by an officer who had, across the course of the war, overseen a considerable number of genuinely audacious raiding operations against targets ranging from St. Nazaire's dry dock to the Dieppe landings, and who placed Frankton, judged purely on the combination of physical risk accepted and result achieved relative to the resources committed, at the very top of that entire list. The human cost of the operation, weighed honestly against its results, was severe in a manner that few other British raiding operations of the war matched proportionally. Of the 10 Royal Marines who had originally set out from HMS Tuna in 5 canoes, 2 died of hypothermia in the tide race at the mouth of the Gironde before the mission had properly begun. 6 more were captured over the following days, either on the river itself or during the overland escape phase, and executed under Hitler's commando order rather than held as conventional prisoners of war. And only 2, Hassler and Sparks, ultimately survived the entire operation and made it back to Britain. An 80% casualty rate, measured across the 10 men who took part, represented a level of loss that, applied to almost any other category of military operation across the war, would have marked the raid as a catastrophic failure regardless of whatever tactical result had been achieved, and it reflected, with a clarity the operation's own planners had never attempted to disguise from the volunteers who took part in it, the essentially one-way nature of a mission built from the outset around accepting that the great majority of the men who paddled away from the submarine that first night would very likely never return, in exchange for the possibility that a handful of them, moving quietly enough and disciplined enough, might reach a target that nothing else in the Allied arsenal could touch. Of the surviving participants, Hassler was awarded the Distinguished Service Order for his leadership of the raid, and was, according to several published accounts, recommended for the Victoria Cross as well. a recommendation that was ultimately not approved on the technical grounds that the specific award required action taken in the face of the enemy, a category that, under the strict definitions applied by the Honors Committee reviewing the case, did not neatly encompass the particular combination of stealth, evasion, and sustained physical endurance across 5 nights of largely unopposed but relentlessly dangerous river navigation that had actually defined Hassler's conduct throughout the mission, a bureaucratic distinction that did little to diminish the broader reputation the raid earned him within the Royal Marines and within combined operations more widely. Sparks received the Distinguished Service Medal, and Laver and Mills, killed after capture, were posthumously mentioned in dispatches, a more limited form of official recognition that reflected, in part, the genuine difficulty the honor system of the period faced in appropriately recognizing men whose deaths had come not in the direct heat of a completed engagement, but in the considerably more drawn-out and, in its own way, equally harrowing circumstances of capture and subsequent execution under a policy that offered them no formal recourse to the ordinary protections of the laws of war at all. The broader legacy of Operation Frankton extended well beyond the specific, tactical and strategic assessment of the Bordeaux raid itself, shaping the subsequent development of British Special Forces in ways that proved considerably more durable than the 6 damaged German merchant ships the raid had actually achieved in the moment. The Royal Marines Boom Patrol detachment that Hassler had built and trained specifically for this mission became, in the years following the war, one of the direct institutional ancestors of the Special Boat Service, the Royal Navy's own Specialized Maritime Special Forces Unit, an organizational lineage that traced its founding operational concept, small teams, minimal equipment, silent waterborne infiltration of targets no conventional force could reach, directly back to the specific combination of training, discipline, and canoe-borne tactics Hassler had spent 2 years developing before a single cockle Mark II ever paddled up the Gironde. The raid's popular memory, cemented considerably by the 1955 feature film that dramatized the operation for a broad post-war audience under the title that gave the raiders their enduring popular name, The Cockleshell Heroes, kept the story of the mission in wider public consciousness for decades, after the more strictly tactical assessment of its results had settled into the more measured, mixed verdict that professional military historians have generally applied to it since. A raid that achieved real but limited physical damage, at an extraordinarily high proportional cost in the lives of the men who carried it out, but that demonstrated, with the clarity no amount of subsequent analysis has seriously disputed, that a target considered entirely secure from a light attack by every conventional method available in 1942 had, in fact, never been secure at all, provided the attacking force was willing to approach it in a vessel small enough, quiet enough, and disciplined enough that nobody defending the target had ever seriously considered it worth guarding against. What Operation Frankton ultimately demonstrated, in a form distinct even from the broader pattern of British wartime improvisation that produced the Q-ship, the armed trawler, the midget submarine, and the CAM ship's expendable Hurricane across the same conflict, was that the calculus determining whether a target could be reached by an attacking force was never simply a function of that target's distance from open water, the strength of its garrison, or the density of its defensive patrols, but of what specific category of threat those defenses had actually been built and manned to detect. Bordeaux's harbor defenses, considerable as they genuinely were, had been organized and postured against the threats German planners judged realistic: air raids, naval bombardment, and conventional infiltration by larger, more obviously military vessels or personnel moving on land. Nothing in that defensive posture had been specifically built to detect 10 men in 5 collapsible canvas kayaks, moving only by night, freezing motionless in the water at the first hint of a searchlight, indistinguishable at a glance from the ordinary flotsam, Any river carries past a tired sentry's position on any given night. 2 of those 10 men reached Bordeaux, placed their mines, and disappeared back into occupied France before a single German soldier fully understood what had actually happened to the 6 ships that began exploding in their own harbor over the following hours. 8 of the 10 men who made that possible never made it home, and the operation they gave their lives to complete never achieved the total permanent closure of Bordeaux harbor that its most ambitious original planning had hoped for. But for one night in December 1942, the most heavily defended inland port on the entire French Atlantic coast learned, at considerable and lasting cost to both sides, that there was no longer any such thing as a harbor too far inland, too well patrolled, or too obviously secure for the Royal Navy to reach, provided the men willing to make that reach were prepared to do it in a boat built from little more than canvas, plywood, and the particular, hard-won discipline of staying perfectly, silently still.